While we're at home during the COVID-19 pandemic, the New Zealand Chamber and the New Zealand High Commission here in Singapore are working to provide relevant content and information for New Zealanders. We thought it'd be interesting to have conversations with high-profile experts in their fields. My name's Rachel Boyle and I'm the Executive Director at the New Zealand Chamber in Singapore. In this first talk, Peter Kemp, the New Zealand Deputy High Commissioner to Singapore, and I have a chat to Dr. David Skilling. David is a New Zealander and the founding director of Landfall Strategy Group, a Netherlands-based economic and policy advisory firm that provides analysis and advice focused on small advanced economies. David serves private and government clients around the world, bringing distinctive insights on policy priorities and for small economies to respond effectively to global, political and policy developments. So he's the perfect person to talk to right now. David was based in Singapore for 11 years and left in December last year. David also writes regularly on global economic and political issues, including in the Wall Street Journal and Singapore's Straits Times. New Zealand and Singapore have a lot in common, being small advanced economies surrounded by water and both heavily reliant on tourism and trade. The two countries have a special relationship as demonstrated by the enhanced partnership signed by both Prime Ministers in May of last year. More recently, our Prime Ministers, Foreign Ministers and Trade Ministers have shared conversations on combating COVID-19 within each country. In our chat today, we focus specifically on the New Zealand and Singapore economies and David's thoughts on how these two countries will fare in the short, medium and long term as we move through the COVID-19 pandemic. We talk about the impact on the tourism industry in both countries and the ability for Singapore and New Zealand to work together to get through this. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Well, welcome to Dr. David Skilling, who we've got here today all the way from the Netherlands. I know it's early for you in the morning. And also with me today is Peter Kemp, New Zealand's Deputy High Commissioner to Singapore. So Peter and I are just going to have a conversation with you today, David, and pick your expert brains a little bit about COVID-19 and the impacts on Singapore and New Zealand and what we can learn from this. So yeah, Pete, do you want to kick off with the first question?
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Rachel. David, I'm really interested, starting in a really general way. Looking back at history, you see past pandemics have often led to social and economic change, often changing the course of history quite a bit. How do you see COVID having an impact on societies and economies?
Well, it's too early to be precise, of course. You're absolutely right that historically pandemics have led to very significant social and economic change. You go back to the plague several hundred years ago and the like. More recently, the evidence is a little bit more mixed. And obviously the Spanish flu 100 years ago killed many millions of people, but it was, if you like, lost a little bit because of the end of World War I and all the other changes in and around that. So it's difficult to say that had a hugely significant change. Similarly, there was a serious outbreak of flu around the world in the late 1950s. And again, that's, if you like, been airbrushed from history. Much more recently, SARS, of course, in 2003 in East Asia was a pretty big deal. It had mortality rates of sort of 8–9%. So, of those who got it, it was fairly deadly. And that caused a very sharp recession in places like Singapore and Hong Kong and the like. But it was reasonably V-shaped, right? So it was countries like Singapore were hurt very hard, but within 1 or 2 quarters, recovery was in hold because it wasn't nearly as contagious as what we're seeing with COVID-19. So SARS, aside from leading to greater willingness to get prepared and build government capability around future pandemics, didn't really lead to very much of a significant sort of change. This time around, I think we should expect much more of a new normal to emerge. I mean, the global reach of COVID-19, the fact that no part of the world has been untouched, the fact that it's so contagious, the death rates are not where SARS was, fortunately, but still we've got many tens of thousands of people around the world dying, 2 million plus being infected. And obviously the government measures for lockdowns in many parts of the world are changing the way in which commerce is conducted, the way in which businesses are organising themselves, the way we live our lives. And because this is not just a 1-week lockdown, it's a month, 2 month in the case of Italy and the like sort of lockdown. I'm fully expecting this is going to have major implications for economic and social life on a range of dimensions that will endure, even once we're out of the formal lockdown process.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And looking at the different government responses to COVID-19 in New Zealand and Singapore, what do you think, what are your predictions for the economic outcomes of each country? And if we look at kind of the short term, the medium term, and the long term, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
The easy questions. Well, I mean, if you like, at a general level, lockdowns work, right? So lockdowns curb the number of infections, leads to growth in infections, and hopefully drive them, at least in New Zealand's case, close towards zero. In Singapore's case, of course, it's been a bit stop-start. It looked like the virus was under control for a time, then it got away, particularly in terms of worker dormitories, and so tighter restrictions. But the expectation, of course, is that the tighter lockdown measures or circuit breakers that have been imposed will again work. But of course, the flip side of that, and we see that not just in Singapore and New Zealand, but around the world, is that the tighter the lockdown restrictions are, there's more significant the economic cost, right? So of course, you need to get the disease or the virus under control before you can reopen the economy. So in a sense, it's a necessary thing to do. But in general, the tighter or more stringent the restrictions are, the more significant the short-term economic cost is going to be. Clearly tourism, retail, construction, etc., have taken a big hit. So I saw numbers out for Singapore this morning from DBS, anywhere I think from -6% to -8%, depending on scenarios, which is obviously a bit of a leg down from where things were even a month ago because of the much tighter circuit breaker restrictions. In New Zealand, of course, Treasury came out with various scenarios 2-3 weeks back, which were really ugly, worst case scenarios, which I don't think we'll get to. Had unemployment around 26%, GDP going down by about 1/3 before recovering into the end of the year and into next. So if you like, there's a pretty direct relationship. The tighter that you lock the economy down, the sharper the recession is going to be. And it's true around the world. I mean, even despite the fiscal stimulus that New Zealand and Singapore and others are throwing at this, it's not going to fully compensate for the loss in economic output. The hope, of course, is that once you've endured this sort of short, sharp process, you've locked the economy down, you've driven cases down to zero in New Zealand's case, or under control in many others, you can then begin to restart your economy and things begin to bounce back. But I think that expectations on how robust that recovery process is going to be have become more conservative over time, because this has gone on now for a long time. People are cautious, so even if you open everything up tomorrow, and we saw this in Germany over the weekend, Germany has opened shops and the like, very, very few people on the streets, because yes, you can go shopping, but really, do you want to take the risk of going to a busy shopping street? You probably don't, right? So I think individual risk aversion is going to take a while to play out, be that retail, be that travel, including to New Zealand. Similarly, in terms of corporates prepared to invest, you just don't really know what the future is going to be look like. So are you going to put lots of money down on big investment? And also just the logistics of reopening the economy from pretty much a cold start. Supply chains, planes, ships are all out of place. It's just going to take a while. So I think the medium-term process is going to be bumpy and jagged. It's going to be a very kind of stop-start. And given the properties of this virus, at least from what we know, you really shouldn't rule out sort of second and third waves, be that in the US, be that in various parts of the emerging world, where obviously public health systems are stretched. So I think it's going to be a bumpy, sort of jagged process out of here. And so even the IMF that came out with fairly downbeat forecasts last week, with a sort of a rebound through the end of 2020 into 21, I think that's, to be honest, overly optimistic. I think it's going to be a long, hard process. Economic activity will return, but it's going to take a long time to catch up. And then the long term, the final part of your question is, I guess, even the more unknowable, partly for reasons that I mentioned a moment ago, which is, so much I think is in flux. There are some sectors, I think, like tourism, unfortunately for New Zealand and Singapore, where it's going to be a very, very long road back, and where I don't expect the kind of the trend growth rates that we saw pre-COVID to return anytime soon. On the other hand, you've got sectors like digital, like tech, where you can see, we're talking on Zoom, that kind of whole kind of cluster, that ecosystem around tech, I think is going to be much more positive. So it's going to be a story, I think, that's very variable across sectors. It's going to be very variable across countries. I think countries that manage this process well, including New Zealand, including Singapore, but also some Europeans, will come out of it a lot better than countries like the US that I think have essentially bungled a response and done it very, very poorly. And I think also countries, again, including Singapore, that are thinking hard about what that future looks like. Where are the opportunities, if you like, coming out of this that we could begin to invest in now? I think those countries that are most prepared to invest in foresight, that are really having those forward-leaning conversations now, are much better placed than countries that are kind of stumbling into the future.
David, in terms of the kind of turbulent future you've discussed, New Zealand and Singapore are both small, open trading economies. Do you think that position is an advantage or disadvantage in the kind of medium and long term?
Well, I mean, I think it's a necessity. I mean, because we are small by necessity, we are open. We're simply not large enough in terms of our domestic market, be it Singapore or New Zealand, to get to scale, to be self-sufficient in all of the things that we need. So New Zealand, in a sense, has some advantages, I suppose, on the food and agriculture side, or at least we can feed ourselves. Singapore is clearly less well placed to do that. The story of small economies is that the external sectors, be it agriculture or tourism or other services, are the growth engines of those economies. So there's kind of the basics. You need to import food or refined petroleum just to kind of keep the engine running. But if you're looking for job growth, for income growth, for wages, you need external sectors. And so, I don't think, in a sense, obviously being open creates a set of exposures for you, be it for pandemic or external shocks or what have you. But the harsh reality for small countries is that you need to be exposed to that world. You just need to be thoughtful about the way in which you do that. So you build resilience and buffers and the like. I think the other thing that being small and open does for you, which is painful, but I think a source of advantage, is that it creates, because of this exposure, it creates a competitive discipline, right? You are aware that you are exposed to this world. You need to navigate through these things. If you're the US or France, you can kind of kid yourself that you're big enough and you don't really need to worry about anyone else. For New Zealand and Singapore, we know that's not true, right? And as a consequence, you do things, you prepare for things with an intensity that perhaps other countries don't. And I've been on the phone with Singapore agencies during the week talking about these issues. When I'm asked, when I'm overseas, what's the secret of Singapore? My answer is generally some version of paranoia, right? They think hard, they're a sense of their vulnerability. New Zealand a bit less so, of course, because we're at the other end of the world and we can feed ourselves. Perhaps that paranoia is a little bit less acute. Well, it is a lot less acute. In Singapore, not so much. But I think even for New Zealand, there is that sense that actually we have to navigate ourselves through this. Even though sort of our geography is a source of advantage through the managing the pandemic phase, and we've got this big geographic moat, if you like, which makes it obviously a good deal easier to kind of get on top of this. When we come out of this, hopefully in the near future, we are going to need to think very hard about how do we reopen those connections to the rest of the world, be it maybe to Australia in the first instance, but to others in due course. So we have to figure out how we can re-engage. Being disconnected is fine and probably necessary for a period of time, but it's not steady state. Autarky doesn't really work for anybody. And I think, if you look around the rest of the small advanced economy world more generally, you see a very similar story. And it's interesting to note when you look at the IMF growth forecasts, small economies are projected, albeit with significant uncertainty, but they are projected to continue to do at least as well as large economies. So I don't think there's any sense in which being small and being open is a disadvantage. It's all what you do with it, I guess.
And in terms of, David, what you do with it, New Zealand and Singapore are, of course, geographically a long way apart. But should we be doing more? And if we were going to be doing more together, what would that look like? And a third part of the question would be, New Zealand has a long history of economic integration with Australia. Is there a model in there in terms of Singapore?
Yeah, look, I think there is. Obviously, New Zealand and Singapore are doing a lot in terms of open borders and supply chains, both in terms of food, in terms of pharmaceuticals. And I think a little bit like New Zealand and Singapore's role in starting the TPP with the P4 arrangement. This model where New Zealand and Singapore and other like-minded small countries can get together and say, look, here's the idea. Here's what we'd like to do. Here's kind of the framework for an agreement. And then go and seek other people to kind of bolt on to that agreement. I think that's a model that's working, that has worked very well, obviously with TPP, with the immediate pandemic response, and I think will continue to work well, and is necessary, because if you look at all the other multilateral institutions around the world, be it the G20 or the UN, they have gone AWOL. They're simply not doing anything. And the large countries are unable or unwilling to exercise global leadership. So, the fact that we've got this kind of bottom-up small country leadership with New Zealand and Singapore in the vanguard of that, I think is really, really good. I mean, as a New Zealander, it's fantastic to see New Zealand playing such a leadership role, and I think will be sort of very useful globally as well. I think in terms of the kind of the public health dimensions of the pandemic, I was struck over the weekend or end of last week. Austria had convened a phone call, including New Zealand. Singapore was meant to join but couldn't at the last moment. But a whole bunch of other what they called small smart countries, so Israel, some of the Nordics, New Zealand obviously, and the like, trying to share lessons about how countries of a reasonably small size can learn from each other in terms of how you organise society, how you organise public health response. So I think that New Zealand, Singapore have a lot to offer both each other small countries, but also the world in terms of how you maintain openness, how you organise public health responses, and can provide a leadership role. So the fact that we are small doesn't mean we have no agency. It doesn't mean we have no influence. I think actually we've done a pretty good job. And New Zealand's sitting on the other side of the world. New Zealand's soft power, if you like, our standing in the world, our reputation, is sky high. Other countries have also managed to do this well, and their standing has increased also. But New Zealand is right there up there in terms of how well we seem to have managed, both in a kind of a technical public health sense, but also the messaging, the social cohesion, and so on. So I think that's something to build on. But obviously, the value we can extract from that depends on having a clear view on how we would like to deploy that and exactly what we are going to do. But I think New Zealand and Singapore are both in a very, very good place internationally, have been doing great work. Going forward, I think more of the same. I don't have specific suggestions, but I think the playing field, if you like, is open for countries with ideas that actually want to get stuff done, because the big guys simply aren't doing that. Just in closing, you mentioned Australia. I think there is real space for something triangular in nature, where Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore are doing things jointly. Australia's been involved in some of the measures that I mentioned a moment ago. But if you also think about the potential for opening of borders to tourism, to people flows, to international education, and like obviously Singapore and New Zealand have a deep relationship in that sense, so do Singapore and Australia. And there's a lot of sort of deep institutional connective tissue, if you like, between the three countries. All of them are doing pretty well on curbing COVID. Obviously, Singapore is a bit of an outlier, primarily because of the situation in the dormitories for foreign workers. Outside of those, the numbers in Singapore have been reducing, as you know. So, you give it, I don't know exactly what the period is, a month, 2 months, where things look under control in the three countries. And the conversations underway between opening borders between New Zealand and Australia, for tourism at least, you could see extending potentially to Singapore, with appropriate safeguards and the like. But I think New Zealand, Singapore, Australia make a pretty good grouping, and I think there would be real appetite in all of those countries to do something.
That sounds pretty positive anyway, and kind of leads into my next question, which was around tourism. And obviously New Zealand and Singapore are both small islands really reliant on tourism as an earner. And what can governments do now to help tourism bounce back, once borders open up?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, particularly for New Zealand, but also for Singapore, which is we are not the main player here. All right, I mean, New Zealand could throw open its borders next week. The issue then is who would come, right? Partly because all the countries from whom tourists would come have got closed borders, either on the way out or on the way back in. So, airlines are in trouble around the world. They're reducing seat capacity and the like. So, and if you have to go through a 14-day quarantine period, which is in place in New Zealand at the moment, but also for many countries on the way back in, going for a 2 or 3 week holiday obviously becomes not a feasible thing to do. So this is going to take some time. I think it's going to be very step by step, perhaps opening, as I mentioned a moment ago, with with Australia, possibly with Singapore, finding countries with whom we have deep kind of institutional trust. We kind of trust their systems, their processes, countries with whom there's a sense of sort of like-mindedness, if you like, and beginning in a stepwise fashion with them, adhering to sort of social distancing with whatever quarantine procedures are required. Now, obviously, that's going to take it's going to impose a cost. Not everyone is going to be able to comply with those measures, or frankly, want to fly, given that, particularly for long-haul tourism, which matters a lot for New Zealand, locking yourself in a plane for 10 or 12 hours to get to New Zealand with other people is not something that many others want to do at the moment. So again, I can see this beginning to kind of claw its way back over the next sort of 3 or 4 months as we open up to some selected markets. But I think, to put it bluntly, this calendar year is essentially a write-off for New Zealand tourism. We might get a bit back towards the end of the year. And then going beyond that, as I mentioned, airlines are in deep trouble, so seat capacity growth is going to be limited. There's probably going to be social distancing measures on planes, health checks, quarantining, individual uncertainty about, do I really want to go? So, New Zealand tourism, Singapore tourism is going to be in trouble for a time. Singapore tourism has a slight advantage that a lot more of it is shorter haul. So perhaps people will be prepared to sit on a plane for a couple of hours in a way, but coming from Singapore, flying 10, 11 hours, maybe not so much. And also there's a lot more business travel coming into Singapore, which is helpful, right? MNCs are here, people have to come and check out operations in a way that happens to a much lesser extent in New Zealand. So I think the nature and profile of New Zealand tourism is a bit more exposed to the kind of the aftershocks of this than is Singapore. Clearly Singapore will continue to hurt, but I think New Zealand is more exposed. What can the government do? There are some things. I mean, obviously, tourism sector, along with other sectors, is getting various wage subsidies. People are getting put on sort of these various temporary measures. It will have to do something. Well, it has signalled this around Air New Zealand in terms of providing some longer-term support, as we've had to with previous crises where Air New Zealand needs some help. I think that's entirely appropriate, given the vital bit of infrastructure that it is. Outside of that, and particularly given the longevity, I think, of the shock and before things return to normal, it's difficult to see what the government can do. It might be that specific firms are propped up. I think that the work really needs to be on the figuring out which markets, which routes can be opened up soon, which governments can we work with, Australia, Singapore, potentially others over time, and really working hard to get people in. But I think we should be fairly cautious in terms of our optimism. And this is, one of the big economic shocks for New Zealand. I mean, tourism is a major export earner. You put it all together, it's bigger than dairy. It employs, probably a little bit under 15% of a workforce, which is a big number. And it's got unusual properties in terms of that. The geographic footprint of that employment is spread through the regions, be it Rotorua or Queenstown or Taupo. And so it's, with those jobs knocked out, the aftershocks, the economic aftershocks of that are going to be significant. So tourism should be, one of the priorities in terms of both the support, but also figuring out how we can get that open for business. But again, I think that's just going to take some time. And even with the best will in the world from a New Zealand perspective, we don't make all the decisions here. A lot of the decisions are taken by other governments, other airlines, sort of tourists from other countries. And that's a little bit unknown in terms of how quickly that's going to bounce back.
Yeah, so we've talked about tourism, which is obviously going to be hit. What other areas of the economies globally do you see being hardest hit? And do you think within New Zealand and Singapore these will be the same or different from other economies?
Yeah, well, I mean, around the world you do lockdowns and you basically kill retail, hospitality, construction to an extent, depending on what restrictions you put on that sector. And so around the world, you just see those sectors kind of nosediving in terms of economic output and the like. In a sense, the slight good news is that once you kind of unleash the lockdown measures, those sectors should begin to bounce back. Clearly, not everyone will. And the financial damage done, particularly to smaller firms, they might not be around. If you're a restaurant or a bar or a cafe, you may not have the financial resources to kind of get yourself through that period and kind of revert to normal. But the impact on things like retail, on hospitality and the like is, in the scheme of things, probably going to be more V-shaped, very sharp, in some cases down to zero, more or less. But those are sectors where it's easier in the scheme of things to kind of restart. There aren't huge fixed costs, supply chains aren't super complex. And so as you begin to relax those, activity should begin to return to normal, albeit gradually and slowly. because people may not be willing to go eat in crowded restaurants and the like. You know, other sectors, it's going to be more complicated. So anything in the manufacturing space that involves logistics, cross-border flows, it's just much harder to kind of get those sectors up and running. But I think there are some structural losers, if you like, sectors where, you know, I think trend rates of growth are going to be structurally lower. Tourism, we've talked about a bit, is just kind of one of those, unfortunately for New Zealand, given what a significant earner it is, and obviously not just for New Zealand or for Singapore, but for many other countries, tourism has been an enormous growth sector. But I think, you know, tourism, the aviation sector, I think things like automotive, you know, those sectors are going to be very badly hit. For New Zealand, obviously, tourism is the big exposure we have there. On the flip side, in terms of, you know, which sectors are going to come out of this with enhanced growth opportunities, you know, the two that are most commonly pointed to, I think, sensibly, are one, digital and tech. You know, the fact that people are, you know, transitioning much more rapidly to digital, you know, for convenience, you know, because, and even for sort of retail establishments and the like, you know, doing online shopping is a way of protecting your staff, right? Do you really want to put your frontline staff in constant exposure with customers coming in? In many European countries, the answer is actually not really. So online shopping, anything digital, the way that firms organize themselves, the move to remote working, you know, all of that kind of cluster of technologies, I think is going to continue to do very well, which is why valuations in the tech sector in the US continue to be sky high, despite the fact that the world is in a very sharp recession. But I think that does make, you know, I'm not going to defend valuations in the US stock market, but you can kind of understand why the tech sector is doing okay. And I think similarly in the public health space or in the health sector, there's obviously going to be demand. So New Zealand, there's some upside there. Obviously, New Zealand's got you know, some strengths in the tech sector, perhaps not with as many large companies as in Europe or the US, but we've got some strengths there. And so I think, you know, that the trick for New Zealand and for others coming out is forming a view on what does this new normal look like, certainly from an economic perspective, and figuring out, you know, what do we bring to the table, what strengths do we have, what companies do we have, and what investments do we need to make to position those firms and those sectors of the economy. Because, you know, the reality is New Zealand will need to develop some new growth engines. You know, if tourism, if my claim is right, and tourism is in, you know, structural difficulty for some time, you know, New Zealand will need to develop some additional growth engines to offset or to compensate for that loss. And so figuring out where they are, what they look like, what type of investments need to be made. And in that context, I'd reference the investments that New Zealand's made in ultra-fast broadband over the past decade. So my parting gift, if you like, to New Zealand just before I left was to work with the government, the then government, with John Key on the case for deploying USB around the country. We thought it was a very strong economic investment case to be made because of our remoteness. And we've seen, I think, some of the value from that, you know, over the last month or two. You know, if we didn't have a very strong fibre-based backbone in New Zealand, you know, it would have been difficult to have people working from home. It just would have been really difficult. So, in a sense, the question that raises is, well, what's the next generation of investment? What do we need to do to position these new parts of the economy for strength? And so I think, you know, the predecessor to all of that is, you know, are we having the conversations in New Zealand about some of these structural challenges and opportunities? You know, we kind of have a clearer view on what currently exists that may not do so well going forward. I think agriculture will continue to do kind of okay because food and beverage demand will probably keep on keeping up. Supply chains aren't super complex. But where are the opportunities that perhaps don't really exist at the moment, at least not at scale, that we really need to invest behind? What does that look like? What's the role for government? What's the role for business? Those are conversations I think we need to be having in New Zealand to kind of make sure that we make the most of whatever world begins to emerge.
Yeah.
And Dave, maybe coming back out, talking about the world and COVID, some commentators talk about this being a further death knell to globalisation or a kind of further reverse. How do you see the kind of trend of globalisation, liberal trade going forward? Is the genie out of the bottle already? Is it true? You know, is it things going to continue, or is it going to be different in some way?
Well, it depends which genie out of which bottle. I'm not in the super pessimistic camp. I mean, the story, you know, at a very high level, let's say from the late 1980s, early 1990s through to just before the global financial crisis, was very strong growth in globalization. So if you look at world trade to world GDP, direct investment flows, people flows, and like that was on an upward tear, right, growing very, very strongly. Partly the growth of China, other emerging markets, supply chain, strong global growth, and the like. And then, roughly speaking, for the last decade or so, all those various measures of trade and intensity of globalization have pretty much gone sideways, right? So it's partly a more sluggish global economy, partly a sense that these supply chains have been pushed about as far as they can be. Labour costs were beginning to increase in emerging markets. People were beginning to kind of come back, or at least not expand much more. Obviously, latterly over the last 2-3 years, we've had trade wars, US-China, various trade tensions, a bit more politics involved in economics, all of which has kind of put a bit of a dampener, if you like, on further growth in globalization. But it also depends a bit on which globalization you are looking at, right? So if you look at cross-border flows of merchandise trade, goods, and the like, that is very pronounced, that process of flattening off. If you look at cross-border flows of services, be it tourism, export, education, business and financial services, actually the story is a bit less clear, but growth rates have actually kept on reasonably strongly. And certainly in terms of cross-border flows of knowledge, of ideas, that's continued to grow very, very strongly. And so I think going forward, clearly there is a very sharp shock to global trade over the next sort of 1-2 years. Plus, all the forecasts from the World Trade Organization and others are for world trade through this year to be down anywhere between 12% and 30%. So obviously that's a very, very big number, and that's partly just because supply chains have seized up, and then hopefully things will begin to revert. But I think the most likely scenario is not for a reverse of globalization, as much as we've reached kind of at least in terms of trade flows, we've probably reached about the high watermark. I wouldn't expect huge amounts of upside, but neither am I in the camp where I'm saying this is an unwinding of globalization, trade barriers are going up everywhere. I think what we are likely to see, and the impact on this on New Zealand is actually can be a little bit challenging, is probably reducing average distance of trade, by which I mean the global economy is going to become a lot more regional in nature, right? So you go back to the sort of 10, 15 years ago, Tom Friedman, world is flat, global economy was kind of this huge big playing field, and MNCs were kind of investing everywhere, and distance was kind of irrelevant. We had these conversations in Wellington in the early 2000s that New Zealand was liberated because distance was no longer there. Actually, that was never really the case. And it's certainly not the case anymore. A combination of technology, automation, 3D printing, coupled with politics, the fact that people want to create more regional or national champions, plus the fact that you want to build a bit more resilience into your supply chains, I think pushes the global economy to a more kind of regional model. So more Asian focused, more European focused, perhaps a bit more American focused, depending on where you sit in the world. So I think globalization is going to change in shape. It may change on some dimensions a little bit in intensity, but I don't think the whole kind of pyramid is about to crumble. I don't think we're moving kind of into a sort of out and out sort of trade wars. There'll certainly be frictions that will be challenging for small advanced economies to navigate. But again, I go back to my earlier comments. Countries like New Zealand, like Singapore, I think have done a very good job in helping to kind of shape the debate. In some cases, shape the institutions in and around that. I think we should continue to do that, and we should just be very alive to the fact that we can't be naive about this. We can't just go in thinking everyone's kind of like us. Reality is people aren't like us. They think about trade differently. Big countries act like big countries. I think one particular issue for New Zealand is navigating the China relationship. China-US, China-Europe relations coming out of COVID are bad. Europe has had a pretty good relationship with China, a bit like New Zealand, seeing it mainly as a commercial opportunity. The China-Europe relationship has really soured over the last couple of months or so. And so for New Zealand as a kind of a Western outpost, if you like, in the South Pacific with an independent foreign policy, we're going to have to figure out kind of how we play China, which is our dominant export market. So, those are the issues that I would be worried about more than kind of the existential questions about the end of globalization. I think the genie is out of the bottle in terms of globalization. Once you're used to transacting globally, it's actually kind of hard to sift the genie back in the bottle. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent about this. There are some very big challenges, China being one, a more regional economy being another. And we are just going to have to get used to these political sort of tensions cropping up from time to time. So it's going to be a more complex world for New Zealand and for Singapore to navigate. Is it doable? Yes. But we have to be a lot more hard-headed, I think, about it than perhaps we have been historically.
Yes. Wow, David, thank you so much for your time today. And I think the positive that I'm taking out of this is that there's a real opportunity for Singapore and New Zealand to shape our futures and where they want to take their economies and work together to do that. So I think that's a really nice takeaway. It's going to take a long time, and there's going to be some struggles to get there, but you know, where there's a will, there's a way, and let's hope it can be done.
Yes, indeed, indeed.